One question I see pop up frequently on our videos is people asking for advice for controller players. Apex has a lot of roller players, so it doesn't surprise me that the majority of people watching would be on the sticks. So hello everyone, I'm your hostess with the mostest, 8-Second Gaming, and in today's video I'm going to be breaking down some tips for you controller players and get you geared up and be ready to be looking like a pro in no time. This video will be about a lot of topics that cover a wide range of Apex, but if you really want to dive deep into specific areas of your game, you need to check out the GameLeap website right now. Over there, we have tons of highly educational guides made from top level players that cover a wide variety of topics in Apex. And with those, you'll be able to learn about everything that you struggle with in the game, and we have new content being made all the time. So you might end up learning something that you didn't even know was part of Apex. So if you want to hear even more from me, click the link in the description, get yourself a membership, or I'll tell your mom about the secret sock you keep under your bed. Now let's dive back into controller and talk about tip number 1, and that is to dial in your settings. Settings are a huge part of the game. This does go for everyone, but controller has a lot of options to play around with. You really need to find the best sensitivity for you, because if you have too high of a sensitivity, you'll find yourself overcorrecting a lot and having your aim fly all over the place. If your sensitivity is too low, then you'll have a harder time flicking to new targets and can die if people come from unexpected angles. Even your cursor speed can mean life or death, because it can allow you to get an armor swap out of a death box faster and keep you alive in those close quarter fights. When you start diving into the settings, you'll notice something called ALC. That stands for Advanced Look Control, and it is by far one of the best assets for you. This allows you to really fine-tune your aim and sensitivity. You can control the dead zones of the analog sticks. This helps you combat stick drift and making them more snappy and responsive to your movements. You can play around with the response curve. In basic terms, this is a form of mouse acceleration. The more you move the thumbstick, the faster it goes. And if I were to dive into the entirety of ALC and all of the settings for controller, this would end up being way too long of a video. So for the sake of time, I can't quite cover all of those settings here. Though we do have a full video dedicated to breaking down the settings for controller players on our channel already. So if you're having a hard time finding what's best for you and really dialing in, go check out that video after this one. Now moving on, let's talk about tip number 2, and that's to play to the controller's advantages. There's a lot of debatable things in Apex, but one thing that nobody can deny is how strong controllers are in up-close fights because of how consistent they are. Even with that, through my time coaching, I've seen a lot of players be afraid to push into fights and opt to keep them at medium range. This is a very big no-no and something that you should look to stop doing as a controller player. If you watch a lot of the top controller players, they never like to extend fights in the medium range if they don't have to. They are always trying to get as close as possible so that they can abuse their power in those close range fights. Fighting in medium range isn't a bad thing, don't get me wrong, but you don't want to let it get drawn out over time. You need to be looking for opportunities to push in and take positive space as quickly as you can. By doing that, you're giving the enemy team less and less of a chance to take you out before you reach your effective ranges. Now, that being said, you should still practice at medium range fights so that you're comfortable at all ranges. And if you happen to get into a fight where enemies match your movements, meaning when you move up, they move back, then you're still able to deal damage and can control recoil. But again, just always try to play towards your strengths and take advantage of the controller when you can. Now, next up is tip number 3, and this is going to be going over controller looting. Look, we all know how difficult of a time controller players have it when looting. Standing still in a game where time to kill can just be over a second is never a good idea. But how can controller players get around this? Well, one way is to play hybrid for PC players. This means when you fight, you use a controller, but then as soon as you start looting, you swap to mouse and keyboard. Though for console players this isn't really viable, so let's talk about something else, and my first point is to learn how to do the jump loot. When you go into a death box, as the box is about to open, hit jump so that as you're first entering the box, you begin to loot your airborne and not standing still. This gives you a brief period of time where you're harder to hit, and if your cursor speed is dialed in, then you can pull off clutch armor swaps in the middle of fights without being shot. Another option is the sprint and loot. This is one that takes some timing and is a bit harder, so be aware of that. This is where you start sprinting past a box. As soon as you can interact with the box, you do so while still holding sprint. You'll enter the box inventory, but you'll still be sprinting, so not standing still and not an easy target. The death box's radius is only like 5 feet or something, so this is only really practical for grabbing ammo or an armor swap, but it's still a very solid technique to use and one that you should have in your back pocket just in case. And lastly, let's talk about the jump and slide. This one is similar to the first one, but with just an added extra layer of protectiveness. You need to approach the box and use that momentum to jump in a direction, usually left or right of the box. As soon as you open the death box, you can hold crouch, and as soon as your character hits the floor, instead of standing still, you are then sliding in the direction that your momentum was carrying you. This makes you a lot harder to hit instead of just standing still right after, and you're gaining momentum that you can use to your advantage as soon as the death box closes. Now moving on, let's talk about tip number 4, and that's going to be know your limits. Like I said before, controller players want to be up close and personal, but a player who's goated on the sticks is able to play at most ranges, though there is limits and players need to understand those limits. Things like sniper rifles don't pair extremely well with controller players as the higher optics don't gain aim assist, so they are harder to fine-tune aim with. I get that you might like sniping, or you might like the feel of the gun and you don't want to give it up, and I'm not saying to, but understand that sniper optics aren't good for you as a player. Start to pick something up like a 2-4 because it does allow for aim assist to kick in when applicable and can help you out in fights. Understanding limits, finding ways around them is part of growing as a player and will really help you out in certain fights. Now moving on, let's do tip number 5, and that's dropping the ego. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to help someone and they blow me off because they just don't want to listen. I've tried to tell people to lower their sensitivity because it's affecting their aim, but then they tell me it looks cooler to be able to whip the camera around and they like having that mobility. And mobility is nice, but if you're making Helen Keller look like a sharpshooter with your aim, is it really worth it? I've tried to tell people that controller players have advantages in close range fights and they throw all sorts of random excuses at me. Even pro Apex players agree that controller players have advantages in these up close and personal fights. That's why a lot of teams are adopting the 2 mouse and keyboard 1 roller team comp. People seem to think that I'm attacking the input when I say these kinds of things. I'm simply saying you have something very strong that can't be banned. Use and abuse it, win fights with it, go nuts. I personally don't care what input you use. And then there's the people who seem to think that you need a Cronus or Strike Pack in order to be a good controller player. And I'm not going to sit here and deny that some players at the top may be using them. They're undetectable, so we may never know. But that doesn't mean that you have to use one to be good. If you look at players like Enoch, Jen Burton, Verholst, any of these streamers, you'll know that they don't use one. And especially the pro players, because if they ever get to a LAN event, they won't be able to use one and people will catch on very quickly. Players get to the top level without them all the time and do perfectly fine, so get it out of your head that you need one in order to be good. You don't, you just need to practice. Setting up that mental barricade sets you up to fail and you're just giving excuses. Stop giving excuses. You are perfectly good as a player, you just need to fine-tune a few aspects of your gameplay. With using these tips and changing your mindset, you'll be able to start owning every lobby you step foot into and making the other players wish they didn't have to fight you. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button to stay up to date with all of our new Apex videos coming out. If you have any other questions, drop a comment down below. I'm sure either myself or another community member will be able to answer it. Or you can come check out one of my streams over on Twitch TV/8secondgaming and ask me when I'm live. I'm more than happy to chat over there. Thank you all for watching. Once again, I'm 8secondgaming and I will see you in the next one.